Haldol, also known by its generic name haloperidol, is an older first-generation antipsychotic, which are also known as major tranquilizers and neuroleptic medications, that is very, very dangerous. It is by far the most dangerous of all the first-generation antipsychotics, and it should never be used for any reason, under any circumstance. So yes, what I am saying is that I believe that Haldol should be recalled and completely taken off the market. I am not the only person who believes this. According to Dr. Henry Nasrallah, a very prominent research psychiatrist, the FDA would never approve haloperidol today given the serious harm it can do to the brain. It's time to retire this aging neuroleptic. Dr. Nasrallah does get paid a lot of money by the pharmaceutical companies. He's been paid nearly $600,000 to do things like promotional speaking, for example, by the pharmaceutical companies. And he does exaggerate the safety of the second generation antipsychotics, but it is interesting that he does admit that at least Haldol is a very dangerous and neurotoxic medication, and he thinks that Haldol should be taken off the market, just as I do. Here's a little background on the history of Haldol. The very first antipsychotic was chlorpromazine, brand name Thorazine. This medication was first used to treat schizophrenia back in the 1950s. In the early 1960s, haloperidol, or Haldol, was created. Haldol is 50 to 100 times as potent as Thorazine. So, as much as you hear about how powerful of a medication Thorazine is, Haldol is actually 50 to 100 times as potent as Thorazine. Antipsychotics are by far the most dangerous types of medications that psychiatrists use. All antipsychotics, at least the ones that are currently approved for schizophrenia, are actually dopamine-blocking receptor agents. And the reason why they are so dangerous is because dopamine is a very important neurotransmitter. Dopamine plays a major role in your ability to feel motivated and happy. Low amounts of dopamine are what lead to Parkinson's disease, and any medication that actually blocks dopamine, like these medications do, is bound to lead to all kinds of very negative side effects. Now, these medications are used in all kinds of things, like they are prescribed for insomnia. Seroquel is often prescribed for insomnia. Seroquel is a newer antipsychotic, but the newer antipsychotics are no less dangerous than certain older antipsychotics like Thorazine. However, it is true that Haldol is far more dangerous than Seroquel. Haldol is actually the second most dangerous of all the antipsychotic medications, and it's a real testament to just how dangerous the antipsychotic medications are when a drug as dangerous as Haldol is only the second most dangerous drug in its class. The most dangerous antipsychotic and the most dangerous psychiatric medication available is a medication known as Clozaril, generic name clozapine. This medication is even more dangerous than Haldol, and it is known for its ability to destroy your immune system, amongst other things. If you want more information about that, see my video on Clozaril/clozapine, the most dangerous psychiatric drug. I will leave a link to it in the description. Clozaril is known to be more effective for treatment-resistant schizophrenia than the other antipsychotics. Haldol, on the other hand, is not known to be any more effective than the other antipsychotics. I mentioned that Haldol is 50 to 100 times as potent as Thorazine, and it is. It is the most potent of all the first-generation antipsychotics. But when I say it's a potent antipsychotic, that does not mean that it is more effective. In fact, research study after research study has found that Haldol is no more effective than Thorazine or the other antipsychotics. In general, all the antipsychotics are pretty much of very similar efficacy, except for Clozaril, which seems to be a little bit more effective for treatment-resistant schizophrenia. When the FDA decides whether they're going to approve a medication, they always take into consideration, do the benefits outweigh the risks? Now, the only reason why the FDA approved an extremely risky medication like Clozaril is because, in theory, if it's more effective than the other antipsychotics, then under certain very limited circumstances, the benefits might outweigh the risks. But there is no circumstance ever in which Haldol's benefits outweigh the risks. If you are currently taking Haldol, then you should at the very least switch to a different antipsychotic. There are other antipsychotics that are just as effective as Haldol, but a little bit less dangerous. They're still very dangerous, but they're not quite as dangerous as Haldol. When they say that Haldol is high potency, what they mean is it's a very, very potent dopamine antagonist, and therefore you take it in lower doses than you would take, say, Thorazine, which is considered a low potency antipsychotic. But the problem is when you are using a medication that is that strong of a dopamine antagonist, you are bound to have a lot of very problematic and sometimes very damaging side effects. Haldol does damage the brain. It causes brain shrinkage. All antipsychotics actually cause brain shrinkage. If you discontinue the Haldol, hopefully your brain can recover. Although if you switch to another antipsychotic, that antipsychotic can still be toxic to your brain. Haldol is not only proven to cause your brain to shrink, it's proven to cause your brain to shrink very quickly, even after just a couple of hours of first using it. This was quite surprising to some brain researchers. Quote, "We've seen changes in the brain before, but to see significant remodeling of the stratum within a couple of hours is staggering," says Claire Parrish at the Howard Florey Institute for Brain Research in Melbourne, Australia, who was not involved in the study. "Our viewpoint was that only chemical changes would happen in such a short time." Many of the negative side effects of Haldol, which include things like shaking, drooling, restless leg syndrome, and impaired motor abilities, all coincided with the rapid shrinking of the brain that it causes. In spite of the evidence that Haldol was no more effective than medications like Thorazine, Haldol definitely does cause the brain to shrink over the long term as well. In fact, one study showed that it causes the brain to shrink by around 20% after 17 to 27 weeks. Now, there is some conflict in the research. All the research I found does show that Haldol is quite neurotoxic and causes the brain to shrink. However, some of the research claims that Haldol is much more neurotoxic than, say, the second-generation antipsychotics. But other newer research seems to show that the second-generation antipsychotics might be equally as neurotoxic as Haldol. One thing that is clear is that Haldol does cause the brain to shrink, and it causes the brain to shrink very rapidly. Haldol has long been marketed to shrinks as a chemical restraint or as a medication used to force patients into submission. Haldol is also frequently used as a chemical restraint in nursing homes. In fact, a lot of antipsychotics are used as chemical restraints in both psychiatric hospitals and nursing homes. The FDA has actually warned that antipsychotics double the risk of death in patients with dementia, and antipsychotics like Haldol that are dopamine antagonists are simply not effective for the purpose of dementia. And while antipsychotics overall seem to double the risk of death for elderly patients with dementia, for Haldol actually quadruples the risk of death. So once again, antipsychotics in general are very dangerous, but Haldol seems to be especially dangerous. And Haldol seems to be especially utilized for the purpose of restraining people and keeping them under control, and is often referred to as a kind of chemical straitjacket, which is actually a fair characterization of what Haldol is. And Haldol has definitely been marketed for the purpose of controlling patients. This particular ad says assaultive and belligerent and shows a strange image of a black person. Now, research does show that most of the time when chemical restraints are used, it's not really necessary and is primarily used for the convenience of the staff to the detriment of the patient. Haldol has never been approved for the purpose of controlling acts of aggression or assaultive behavior, even though it appears that it was marketed for this purpose. This type of advertising is illegal, and according to the American Bar Association, this type of advertising has been illegal since at least the early 1950s. And that's because it is illegal to market a medication for any purpose which it is not approved for. It's legal to use a medication for something that it's not approved for, but it's not legal to market a medication for something it's not approved for. This kind of advertising is actually considered a type of fraud, and the pharmaceutical companies and their employees can be held both civilly and criminally liable for it. In addition, this particular ad and many of the other ads used to market Haldol were quite stigmatizing to mentally ill people, stigmatizing mentally ill people as somehow abusive and belligerent. Even though the pharmaceutical companies will often claim that what's good for them is what's good for the people who are mentally ill, that's not always the case. In this case, we see the pharmaceutical companies actually making a very stigmatizing and illegal ad for the purpose of selling Haldol. In the Soviet Union, Haldol was actually a preferred agent for the use of pharmaceutical torture. It was widely employed to torture dissidents of the Soviet Union. The reason why Haldol was a preferred agent of torture in the Soviet Union is because Haldol is often a very torturous experience for the patient receiving it. Forcing Haldol upon a patient is a way of punishing them. Dr. Todd Zeller argues that it's time to move away from the use of injected Haldol in emergency situations. He pointed to 8 good reasons to stop using Haldol in emergency settings. One of them is that Haldol causes too much oversedation. Another one is that Haldol too frequently causes dystonic reactions, which are actually a major problem and are considered a medical emergency themselves. Another problem is that patients very much dislike Haldol, and like I said before, Haldol is often like an agent of torture. One thing that I want to point out is, and I believe I've said this before on this channel, oftentimes what's good for the mentally ill and what's good for psychiatrists and pharmaceutical companies are not one and the same. Another thing that Dr. Scott Zeller pointed out is there are other alternatives to Haldol for use in emergency situations that are just as potent and effective. For example, injected ziprasidone or injected olanzapine are just as effective at keeping patients under control and just as effective as a chemical restraint as Haldol is. So, if doctors and other healthcare providers want to force someone into submission, they can always use injected ziprasidone or injected Zyprexa or some other IV antipsychotic that is just as effective at this purpose, but is not quite as dangerous as Haldol. One thing that the literature does agree upon is the fact that Haldol is the antipsychotic, at least amongst the ones available in the United States, that is the most likely to cause extrapyramidal side effects. That stated, because all antipsychotics work by blockading the dopamine D2 receptors, all antipsychotics are capable of causing extrapyramidal symptoms, and in fact, all antipsychotics that are currently available in the United States do cause all of these symptoms, and they actually cause them quite frequently. But none of them cause these symptoms more frequently than Haldol. Here are 4 of the best-known extrapyramidal symptoms listed in order of onset. The first one is acute dystonia, which usually occurs within hours to 5 days. It is characterized by involuntary muscle contractions, spasms, sometimes face grimacing, and sometimes involuntary upward eye movement. The next one is Parkinsonian Ism, which is sometimes called pseudo-Parkinsonian Ism. Parkinsonian Ism usually occurs 5 to 30 days after the first dose of Haldol, and it involves tremor, shuffling gait, drooling, stooped posture, and instability. The next one is akinesia, which usually begins 5 to 60 days after an antipsychotic is used, and it is a sort of extreme form of restlessness where people often have to pace and feel that they just can't stop moving. Finally, there is the most notorious of all these extrapyramidal symptoms, and that is tardive dyskinesia. Tardive dyskinesia is a serious neurological disorder that is often permanent. It often appears as repetitive, jerking movements that can occur in the face, neck, tongue, and extremities, and can be very troubling for the people who have it. Now, I'm not going to get too detailed about tardive dyskinesia in this video because I do plan on discussing it in other videos and also how it sometimes can be cured. But I want to say that the risk for tardive dyskinesia is quite high in spite of what the pharmaceutical companies will tell you. From the beginning, the pharmaceutical companies tried to cover up the existence of tardive dyskinesia, and so did many psychiatrists. Now, the pharmaceutical companies are willing to acknowledge that it did seem to happen a lot with the older medications, but claim that it doesn't happen that often with the newer ones. The reality is, a Yale study actually concluded that after taking antipsychotics in general for 5 years, about 32% of patients will have tardive dyskinesia. After 15 years, 57% of patients will have tardive dyskinesia, and by 25 years, 68% of patients will have tardive dyskinesia. So the pharmaceutical companies were lying when they claimed that tardive dyskinesia is very rare, and that's for antipsychotics, including the new ones. The new ones actually do produce tardive dyskinesia at a pretty high rate. The thing is, you might think, well, 25 years, that's a long time to take a medication, but the problem is shrinks are always telling people that they need to take these medications for the rest of their lives. On top of that, antipsychotics are being prescribed to more and more people than ever before, which means that there's going to be a lot more cases of tardive dyskinesia. But for Haldol, the risk of tardive dyskinesia is much higher. The rate of tardive dyskinesia for Haldol is extremely high. If you give a group of people Haldol for 1 year, 10 to 20% of them will get tardive dyskinesia. Then the next year, an additional 10 to 20% of them who did not already have tardive dyskinesia will get tardive dyskinesia. For every additional year that the group of people take Haldol, an additional 10 to 20% of them will get tardive dyskinesia. That means that after taking Haldol for only 5 years, anywhere from 47 to 67% of the people will have tardive dyskinesia. Now that is an unacceptably high risk of tardive dyskinesia. Today, the FDA likely would not approve Haldol because the benefits of Haldol simply do not outweigh the risks. Haldol should never be used under any situation at this point because there are so many other antipsychotics that are equally as effective as Haldol. There is no reason for any healthcare provider to ever use this medication. It is time for Haldol to be recalled and completely taken off the market. So, if you like this video, go ahead and give it a like, and if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel, click the bell icon for notifications, and together we shall take over the world. You can also find me as Zorkmid123 on Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, and Twitch.